Officer Merrick thought he was making just another routine arrest when he cuffed an elderly black man on the street. But he had no idea he'd just locked up a retired five-star general. That one mistake set off a chain of events he couldn't stop. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Dusk was settling over Crescent Hills when Officer Clint Merrick flicked on his cruiser's headlights. Nothing about his surroundings suggested urgency, just a standard, suburban neighborhood, dozing under the glow of porch lights and flickering televisions. Yet Merrick rolled through every intersection like he was on a mission. After all, in his mind, he was the protector of these nice areas, the ever-watchful, sentinel keeping out what he called the wrong sort. A seasoned officer with 15 years under his belt, Merrick had never risen above patrol duty. He carried a chip on his shoulder the size of a boulder. Whispers at the precinct claimed his temper kept him from promotions. Official complaints, though often hushed, stained his record. But none of that mattered to him. He believed that in these neighborhoods, people were grateful for his hardline approach. He thrived on that feeling of unchallenged authority. Late in the evening, he parked under a street lamp near the Crescent Hills Park. The place was typically deserted around this hour, but rumor had it some folks still strolled the walking paths. That was enough for Merrick to hang around, waiting. Boredom itched at him. He sipped on stale coffee, tapping the steering wheel, eyes scanning for suspicious movement. That's when he noticed a tall, elderly black man stepping out from the park's gate. Even in dim light, the man's posture was impeccable. Back straight, gaze steady. He wore a simple button-down, pressed slacks, and carried a walking stick more out of habit than necessity. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, as though pacing himself for the last leg of his walk. Merrick tensed, flipping his coffee cup onto the passenger seat. "What's an old man like that doing out here this late?" he muttered to himself. In Merrick's worldview, any older black man in a predominantly white neighborhood was automatically suspicious. He turned the key, igniting the engine, pulling out from the curb as if drawn by a magnet. The old man, whose name was General Marcus Winslow, though nobody in this city recognized him, sensed the approach of headlights behind him. He'd spent a lifetime mastering situational awareness. He might have been older now, but those instincts remained razor-sharp. He cast a quick glance back, noticing the patrol car creeping up. Winslow exhaled a weary breath. He'd lived enough, decades, to predict what was coming. He paused at the sidewalk corner, leaning lightly on his cane, waiting for the officer to speak. A brief pang of sadness flickered in his eyes. Despite all his service to the country, despite the medals pinned on him across decades of military distinction, he'd faced discrimination many times. Some battles never ended. Merrick lowered his window, face composed in a sneer. "Evening," he said, voice tinged with condescension. "You got a reason to be wandering around here?" Winslow met the officer's gaze, polite, calm. "Just taking a walk, officer," he replied. His voice was deep, measured, and commanded a quiet authority that few men possessed. But Merrick refused to see dignity or authority. He saw only a potential threat, an outlier in a place he deemed exclusive. "You got ID?" the officer barked, stepping out of his cruiser. He took a broad stance, one hand near his belt. Intimidation 101. Winslow reached slowly for his wallet. "I do," he said quietly. He'd learned to keep calm. He extended an identification card with polite efficiency. Merrick snatched it, barely glancing at the name. "You live around here?" Merrick prodded. Winslow nodded. "My home is a few blocks that way. Mind telling me the address?" There was no reason for that question beyond an attempt to corner him. Winslow's composure never wavered. "Officer, I'm an American citizen, out for a walk. That's all? Merrick sneered, ignoring the ID. Wrong time, wrong place. People around here get nervous seeing strangers so late. The old man had faced entire battalions without flinching. A single overzealous cop didn't rattle him, but he recognized the risk. I understand your concern, officer, Winslow said politely. However, I pose no threat to anyone. His mild tone only fueled Merrick's suspicion. We'll see about that, he said. Turn around, hands on your head. A chill wind rippled across the silent park, rustling leaves against the pavement. Winslow complied, placing his cane gently on the ground. As Merrick performed a rough, unnecessary pat-down, the retired five-star general's mind churned with thoughts of years spent commanding troops, forging alliances, and protecting freedoms. That he could be subjected to such indignity on his own soil carried a tragic irony. Even so, he held steady, letting the officer's hostility slide off him like water off a shield. He'd endured more dire challenges. This was just another chapter in a long book of prejudice. When Merrick found nothing, frustration flashed in his eyes. He nodded once, as though confirming a suspicion. We'll do this down at the station, he muttered, reaching for handcuffs. Winslow closed his eyes. Briefly, sadness and resolve mingling. He made no move to resist. If that's how you want it, he said softly. Because soon, the man in uniform would discover exactly who he'd just hauled in, and that revelation would change everything. General Marcus Winslow, stoic in the abrium, back of Merrick's cruiser, tried to ignore the tight bite of handcuffs around his wrists. His dignity felt bruised more than anything. Decades of service, commands that spanned continents, all overshadowed by a single cop's assumption. He'd never been one to advertise his military rank. He didn't require the typical reverence. But now, ironically, that quiet humility might have landed him in trouble. As the car rumbled along narrow streets, Merrick radioed in. Got a suspicious subject in custody, he said with an air of smugness. Claims he's local, but I'll need to verify. Bringing him in? A crackle from dispatch. Roger that, Officer Merrick. Go ahead. Winslow gazed out the window, memories flickering of times he'd traveled far more hostile terrain. He recalled nights in foreign deserts, where the looming threat of ambush pressed on every nerve. The place he called home was supposed to be safer, freer. Yet here he was, cuffed in his own neighborhood. Suddenly, Merrick's phone rang. He put it on speaker, presumably to show off. Merrick, he answered, a gruff voice on the other end. Heard you snagged some old guy. You sure he's worth bringing in? A twisted grin curved Merrick's lips. Could be one of those. Folks sleeping on benches, messing up the area. Might be wanted. Figure I'll sort it out after I run his prints. Winslow's jaw tightened. He wasn't homeless. His retirement checks alone dwarfed many incomes. He lived in a comfortable, unassuming house. But apparently, none of that mattered to Merrick. In Merrick's world, suspicion equaled guilt when they arrived at the station. The overhead fluorescence buzzed with monotony. The sergeant at the front desk gave Winslow a quick once-over. What's the charge, Merrick? Merrick shrugged. Trespassing, possible loitering. Found him wandering after hours near the park. No explanation. Winslow opened his mouth, but decided not to argue. Let Merrick's ignorance stand until official ID checks pulled up the real story. So he stayed silent, even as they lifted his fingerprints and snapped a mugshot. The bright flash of the camera felt bizarrely surreal. He'd been photographed countless times at ceremonies pinned with stars by presidents, but never like this. You can put him in holding, the sergeant said, with a mild shrug, evidently, unconvinced, but not inclined to challenge Merrick's authority. "We'll see if anything comes up on the system," Merrick smirked. "Should be interesting," he said. Then he leaned close to Winslow, voice low. "Bet you never expected to spend the night in a cell, huh?" Winslow gave him a calm glance. "No, officer, I did not." In the holding cell, a grated bench pressed into Winslow's back. He wasn't the only occupant. 2 other men dozed, smelling of stale whiskey. The general sat erect, ignoring the stares, focusing on patience. This would be sorted out soon enough. He considered letting them do a standard check. Once they saw his record in the federal system, someone would inevitably flip out. The real question: how would Merrick react? Meanwhile, Merrick finished his shift's paperwork, already envisioning the triumphant story he'd spin to his buddies. Another troublemaker, locked away. He was too busy to notice the desk sergeant get a phone call, his expression turning from lazy to wide-eyed in under a second. The sergeant hastily flipped through computer screens, his mouth dropping open. Moments later, the sergeant approached Merrick, lowering his voice. "Hey, that old man you brought in? Something's weird about his background check. The system's pulling up a high-priority flag." Merrick frowned. "Meaning what?" "Meaning," the sergeant said, swallowing, "the Department of Defense has him listed as a retired 5-star general. Highly decorated. I've never seen a record like this. War hero, top-level clearance, multiple tours. This guy's no vagrant." Merrick's heart gave a painful jolt. He forced out a dismissive scoff. "That can't be right. He was just wandering around." The sergeant's tone was uneasy. "The record is crystal clear. General Marcus Winslow, highest rank possible, commander of several major operations. He's basically a legend." Merrick froze. He recalled the old man's steady gaze. Could he have misread the entire situation? But the doubt clashed with his own pride. "So what?" he snapped. "Being a big shot doesn't excuse him from suspicious behavior. I did the job." A hush settled over the station. Other officers, overhearing, exchanged glances. Everyone recognized a potential storm brewing. It wasn't about letting important people break the law. It was about the glaring possibility that Merrick had overstepped, big time. "Captain's on his way," the sergeant added, voice taut. "He wants to speak to the general personally." Alarm bells rang in Merrick's mind, but he kept up his bravado. "We'll see," he muttered, though tension lined his brow. Because, while Merrick had encountered angry citizens and mild pushback before, he'd never faced a tidal wave of consequences that might come from disrespecting a war hero of this magnitude. In that claustrophobic station, everyone sensed the shift. A single arrest on shaky grounds was about to unravel Merrick's illusions of invincibility. And in a corner cell, Marcus Winslow waited with silent composure, knowing the truth of his identity was about to come crashing down on the officer who had scorned him. The station's overhead lights buzzed, reflecting off scuffed floors and battered desks. Captain Raoul Sandoval, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, walked in with a purposeful stride. He glanced around, quickly picking out Merrick, who hovered near the booking counter. Without preamble, Sandoval beckoned him over. "Show me the Bodhisattva's. Man you brought in," Sandoval ordered, his tone clipped. Merrick swallowed, leading the captain down a short hallway to the holding cells. They passed silent stares from fellow officers, tension rolling like thunderclouds. Word had spread that the detainee was no ordinary suspect. In the cell, Marcus Winslow sat upright, eyes closed as though meditating. But the moment footsteps approached, his gaze lifted. He recognized Sandoval's rank pins, read the slight authority in his stance. "General Winslow," Sandoval greeted, voice hushed. Respect shone in his eyes, though he tried to remain professional. "I'm Captain Sandoval. I understand there's been some sort of mix-up." Winslow stood. Even after hours in custody, his posture remained ramrod straight. "That depends on your perspective, Captain," he said softly. "I was on a routine walk through my neighborhood. Then your officer," he flicked his gaze to Merrick, "decided I was suspicious." Sandoval frowned, turning to Merrick. "Did you verify his ID? Did you run his name properly?" Merrick's cheeks burned. "He only gave me a basic card. No mention of any high status," he huffed. "I had reason to believe." "Reason?" Sandoval repeated, a note of coldness creeping in. "What reason, exactly?" Merrick bristled, his usual bravado cracking under the captain's stare. "He refused to give a consistent explanation," he lied, or at least twisted the truth. "The area had break-ins recently." He matched a vague description. Winslow's lips pressed together, but he remained silent. Sandoval shook his head. "From what the desk sergeant told me, the general's record is impeccable. He served for decades, awarded the highest honors. He's a resident. You had no probable cause to arrest him." Merrick floundered. He was out late. People get nervous." "And that justified cuffing him? Bringing him in with no clear charge?" Sandoval's face hardened. "We're not in the business of arresting men for walking while old and black. Officer Merrick?" A hush fell. Winslow said nothing, but the tension in the room felt like a drawn bowstring. Merrick tried once more to salvage the situation. "Look, if he's really some big shot, how was I supposed to know?" "He never told me," Winslow finally spoke. "You never asked, officer, and I have no obligation to announce my rank to prove I'm allowed to stand on a public sidewalk." Sandoval exhaled, bitterness curling in his gut. He'd worked tirelessly to improve community police relations, but Merrick's conduct threatened to undo progress. "General Winslow, you have my apologies," Sandoval said, unlocking the cell door. "I assure you, we will handle this properly." Winslow stepped out, rotating his shoulders. "I appreciate that, Captain," he said, voice measured. "But I'm not here for special treatment. I've seen enough conflict to know accountability matters. If any average citizen had endured this, would you respond the same?" Sandoval stiffened. "We should. That's the standard we strive for." Winslow nodded slowly. Then he turned to Merrick, gaze level. "Son, I don't hate you. I've led soldiers who learned from their mistakes, but what you did was unacceptable." Merrick's mouth opened, closed. He found no words to quell the guilt creeping in around the edges of his arrogance. The presence of this older man, this general, felt overwhelming. Sandoval gently touched Winslow's arm, guiding him away from the holding area. "Let's talk in my office," he offered. "We'll arrange safe transport back to your home. And please, we'd like to hear any formal complaint you wish to file." Winslow inclined his head. "Lead the way, Captain." Behind them, Merrick remained, fists clenched. Hushed whispers from other officers prickled at his ears. Some glared in disbelief. Others smirked, anticipating repercussions. One or two might have felt pity for him, but Merrick's entire world was tilting. He'd never considered the possibility that his casual racism could land him in real trouble, especially trouble involving a five-star general. Moments later, in the captain's modest office, Winslow lowered himself into a chair. The remains of the booking process lingered on him. Slight soreness in his wrists, where the cuffs chafed. the memory of harsh words echoing in his mind. Yet he carried himself with that steady presence one only gains from facing life-or-death scenarios. This station, these people, they hardly rattled him. Sandoval shut the door. "General, I want to personally apologize. Our duty is to protect, not harass. Officer Merrick's actions do not reflect our ideals." Winslow let out a gentle sigh. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I'd prefer we focus on how we prevent this from happening to anyone, not just me." A determined set came over Sandoval's face. "Agreed. First steps, an internal investigation, possible disciplinary action." He paused. "We'd understand if you also pressed charges." Winslow regarded him thoughtfully. "Let's see how seriously you address it. I've spent a career leading teams. I value fairness. If you handle your man with honesty and accountability, that'll guide my decision." Outside that closed door, the station bustled with curiosity, and in a dark corner of the hallway, Merrick seethed with resentment and fear, realizing that this single arrest, fueled by prejudice, might unravel his entire career, because the man he'd wronged had the credibility, the connections, and the moral high ground to ensure real consequences would follow. News traveled faster than a bullet. Within hours, word spread that a decorated five-star general had been wrongfully arrested by one of Crescent Hill's officers. Local reporters caught wind, and soon the station's front steps filled with cameras and microphones. By mid-morning, Captain Sandoval found himself forced into a press briefing. He faced a barrage of questions about Merrick's conduct, department policies, and the potential punishment looming. Meanwhile, in a quiet conference room at City Hall, General Marcus Winslow waited for the mayor to arrive. He'd been invited for a private meeting, presumably to defuse the situation. While he found the sudden surge of public interest overwhelming, he disliked personal attention. He also recognized this as a chance to highlight a broader issue. He sat calmly, posture unyielding, cane resting across his lap, eyes scanning the room with a strategist's precision. Mayor Harriet Langley bustled in, her expression apologetic. "General Winslow," she began, "thank you for coming. I'm so sorry for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience," Winslow repeated gently, a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Being arrested on no grounds is more than an inconvenience." "Madam Mayor," she winced. "You're absolutely right. My office wants to rectify this. Our city's proud to have men of your service living here." Winslow's calm gaze pinned her. "This isn't about me alone. I could handle a minor injustice, but how many others suffer the same treatment with no recourse?" A hush settled. Mayor Langley folded her hands on the table. "We have an ongoing problem with certain officers who act outside protocol. We do discipline them, but perhaps not swiftly enough. I assure you, we're investigating Officer Merrick, but your complaint could expedite or intensify the process." The general nodded. "I want accountability, not a scapegoat. Real, structural change. That includes better training, genuine consequences for racial profiling, and a sincere effort to rebuild trust." Mayor Langley's shoulders sagged. She'd heard such calls before, but rarely from someone with Winslow's clout. "We have community boards, committees. Maybe you could help us shape these reforms?" Winslow considered it. His retirement had been spent quietly, reading, mentoring a few young men in the neighborhood. Yet maybe this was a new mission. "If it drives genuine progress," he said, "I'd be willing to lend my voice." Relief flickered across the mayor's face. "Thank you." She paused. "We're still left with the question of how you wish to proceed regarding the arrest." Winslow exhaled. The memory of Merrick's sneer, the humiliating cuffing, lingered. I'll file a formal complaint. I want an investigation. If Merrick is found guilty of misconduct, he should be dealt with accordingly. No more, no less. A short distance away, Officer Merrick paced in a small, windowless office at the station, reading the writing on the wall. Captain Sandoval had told him to prepare for a disciplinary hearing. The city was in an uproar. Merrick's gut churned. He felt cornered, singled out. In his eyes, everything he'd done was standard procedure. Why was everyone turning against him? He ignored the voice in his head whispering that maybe, just maybe, he'd overreacted. Pride overshadowed reason. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to no one in particular. "I'll lawyer up if they try to scapegoat me." A knock sounded. The station's union rep, a burly man named Gardner, stepped in. "Clint," he said, sighing, "you're in a deep hole. The union can defend you up to a point, but this is a PR nightmare. The mayor, the department, everyone's furious." Merrick clenched his jaw. He was just an old man in a fancy suit, for God's sake. How was I to know he was some top brass general? Gardner spread his hands. "Doesn't matter who he was. The big problem is you had no probable cause. You arrested him for walking in his own neighborhood." Merrick bristled. "Because that neighborhood is usually off-limits to guys like him, right? I was protecting—" "Stop!" Gardner cut him off, eyes flashing. "That attitude is exactly what's burying you. If you don't show remorse, you're done for." Merrick stared at the floor, chest tight. He'd built his entire self-image around tough policing, seeing threats where none existed. Now that bubble had burst, and the weight of accountability loomed. Rage, shame, denial, they all battled within him. Gardner rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, the best approach is to apologize. Claim you misread the situation. Maybe the general goes easy if you show contrition." Merrick's pride flared. "Apologize? He's the one who refused to answer my questions. He—" But the look on Gardner's face told him he was alone in this fight. Sighing in defeat, Merrick folded his arms. "Fine. I'll think about it." Meanwhile, at City Hall, the mayor extended her hand to the general. "Your presence is a gift, sir. Please, let's keep talking." Winslow rose, leaning on his cane. "Of course." He paused at the door, a distant sadness in his gaze. "I've seen men risk their lives under my command for the sake of liberty. If that cause fails here at home, what was it all for?" The mayor had no easy answer. The corridor felt heavy with unspoken truths, and thus the stage was set for a pivotal clash. An officer desperate to save his career, a city scrambling to mend its tarnished image, and a retired general determined to ensure no one else would ever be targeted so casually by the uniform meant to protect them. A week later, the city council chambers bustled with spectators, activists, reporters, and concerned citizens. They'd assembled for an emergency meeting on police accountability. The tension was so thick it felt like a coiled spring. At the front, a long table faced the rows of chairs, nameplates designating council members who whispered among themselves, sharing glances of apprehension. General Marcus Winslow sat near, the front, arms folded gently over his cane. Mayor Langley and Captain Sandoval were beside him, each wearing solemn expressions. Further down, Officer Merrick fidgeted, flanked by Union Rep Gardner. He looked haggard, as though the weight of public scorn had drained him. He'd chosen not to wear his uniform tonight, perhaps aware that it symbolized a trust he'd violated in many people's eyes. Promptly at 6, Councilwoman Irene Marshall called the meeting to order. Her gavel rapped the desk, quelling the murmurs. She introduced the agenda: discussion of reforms, potential discipline for Officer Merrick, and statements from key individuals. Cameras rolled, capturing every moment for local broadcasts. Sandoval spoke first, summarizing the investigation. He confirmed that Merrick had provided insufficient grounds for the arrest. That body cam footage, once forcibly recovered, showed no aggression from Winslow. The short clip had already gone viral. An older gentleman calmly speaking, then Merrick slapping cuffs on him. Public sentiment was damning. Merrick's face reddened as Sandoval cited clear lapses in protocol. The captain recommended immediate suspension without pay, pending a final decision on termination. The union rep tried to mitigate, insisting Merrick deserved due process, but the crowd's hostility was palpable. Then they called General Winslow to speak. He stood, leaning on the cane. Despite the swirl of tension, his voice remained calm, measured. "Council members," he began, "I've traveled the world under orders to protect the freedoms we cherish. I never imagined being handcuffed on my own street for doing nothing more than taking a walk." His gaze swept the room. "I'm not here for vengeance. I'm here so we confront how easily an officer's biases can transform everyday life into a minefield for people like me. If I, with my rank and accolades, can be treated so poorly, what chance does a young black man have, or someone with no titles at all?" The silence was profound. Winslow continued, "I propose we strengthen oversight committees, mandate comprehensive de-escalation training, and enforce transparent disciplinary measures. This city can lead by example. We must break the cycle where certain neighborhoods or faces are seen as threats by default." A burst of applause erupted. Some council members nodded vigorously. Others blinked back tears. Winslow retook his seat, expression subdued but resolute. This was a battle for something bigger than personal restitution. Finally, Councilwoman Marshall turned to Merrick, offering him a chance to respond. He swallowed hard, stood awkwardly, and approached the microphone. His mouth felt dry as he faced the crowd. He hesitated, words clumsy. Pride warred with the reality that every second he stood there, the cameras broadcast his downfall. "I want to apologize," he said at last, voice trembling with strain. "I was doing what I thought was my job. I misjudged General Winslow. I regret that." The apology sounded forced, but it was something. The hush that followed was neither forgiving nor hostile, just watchful. People wanted to see if he'd own up to the deeper issue, the racism fueling his suspicion. Merrick didn't. He simply bowed his head and mumbled, "I'm sorry." Then he sank into his seat, eyes downcast. Councilwoman Marshall cleared her throat, turning to the members. After brief deliberations, they voted unanimously to dismiss Merrick from the force. The city would also consider further actions, possibly criminal charges for wrongful arrest, though that might come later. Across Saudersides Mead, the aisle, Captain Sandoval released a pent-up breath. The mayor reached out, squeezing Winslow's hand in relief. The general inclined his head, emotion flickering in his eyes. This was a step forward, though he knew the journey wasn't over. When the meeting adjourned, reporters clamored for statements. Winslow politely declined interviews, stating he'd said all that needed saying. A swirl of cameras followed Merrick as he slunk away, shoulders stooped, future uncertain. In an almost tragic irony, the man who'd proudly believed his badge granted untouchable authority was now the city's pariah. Outside, the night air felt fresher, freer. General Marcus Winslow paused on the steps of City Hall, gazing at the bright city lights. He nodded thoughtfully, as if acknowledging a new mission that stretched beyond his personal ordeal. As the crowd dispersed, a young reporter caught up to him, phone in hand to record. "General, do you have a final message for the people watching at home?" Winslow tapped his cane gently. "Yes," he said, voice steady. "This country's ideals are only as strong as our willingness to hold ourselves accountable. Let's keep each other honest, so we can be truly free. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you stand for justice and accountability, drop a comment below telling us where you're tuning in from. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss another impactful story. And please share this one with a friend who values fairness. Together, we can spark the change our communities need.